There is a line on your DNA results page that almost nobody reads twice. It sits below the ethnicity chart, below the map, in smaller type, a percentage, usually somewhere between 1 and 4. Next to it, a word that belongs to a species that has been extinct for about 40,000 years. Neanderthal. Most people look at that number the way they look at a fun fact on a cereal box. A curiosity, something to mention at dinner and forget by the weekend. That number is a set of instructions, and they are running in your body right now, in how you feel a cut, in what time you wake up, in how your immune system decides what to attack. In the last 3 years, laboratories have worked out exactly which instructions they are, and what each one does. Your results page will not tell you any of it. It gives you the percentage and stops. So this is what that line is actually doing to you. For most of the 20th century, the story about Neanderthals was simple, and it was flattering to us. They were the brutish draft. We were the finished version. They lost, we won, and the line between us was clean. That story died in 2010 when a team led by Svante Pääbo sequenced the Neanderthal genome and found something nobody could argue with. Their DNA is in us, not metaphorically, physically, in measurable quantities, in billions of living people. Pääbo was given the Nobel Prize in Medicine for it in 2022. So the fact of it has been settled for over a decade, and that is exactly where the public understanding stopped. The number got absorbed into everyday life as a piece of trivia, a percentage you screenshot and send to your brother. But a percentage is not what you inherited. You inherited specific genes, doing specific jobs, and every one of them is still switched on. The question was never how much. The question was which parts, and what do they do? For years, nobody could answer that. Now we can, and the answers are stranger than the number. Laboratories can now name the individual genes and say what each one does and how large the effect is. Your pain, your body clock, what your immune system attacks. But to understand why any of it ended up in you, you have to start with what happened when the two populations met. Around 50,000 years ago, as modern humans moved out of Africa, they walked into territory Neanderthals had already occupied for hundreds of thousands of years. The two populations met, and they had children together. Enough children, often enough, that the genetic record never closed. 50,000 years is roughly 2,000 generations, long enough to sound like mythology, short enough that the material survived. Today, people of non-African descent carry roughly 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. Put that at human scale. About 1 line in every 50 of your genetic instructions was written by a different species. And there is a correction inside this that matters, because the old textbook version was wrong. For a decade, the confident answer was that people of purely African ancestry carried none of it at all. 0. That turned out to be false. They carry small amounts too, from populations that moved back into Africa carrying Neanderthal DNA with them. The clean line the 20th century wanted did not exist anywhere. So this is not a European curiosity. Almost everyone on Earth is carrying some of it. The reason nobody could prove this until recently is that the contamination in a Neanderthal bone is nearly the same molecule as the thing you are trying to read. Ancient DNA survives as wreckage, short, chemically damaged fragments, and most of what you pull out of the bone is soil bacteria and traces of the modern humans who excavated it. Telling archaic human DNA, apart from the dig teams, took clean rooms and a statistical signature for the specific damage that only old DNA carries. Once that worked, the comparison itself was simple. Line up the Neanderthal genome against living people and see whether some populations share more of it than chance allows. They did. Which brings us to the first system where the inheritance was caught doing something. Start with something you have felt. There is a gene called SCN9A. It builds a sodium channel, a gate on the surface of your nerve cells, and it sits in very high concentrations in exactly the neurons that detect damage to your tissue. When you cut yourself, that gate is part of the machinery that decides a signal is worth sending to your brain. 3 variants of that gene came from Neanderthals, 3 specific, cataloged changes, each with a paper behind it. In 2023, a study published in Communications Biology tested what those variants actually do in living people. The finding was that carriers have a lower mechanical pain threshold. In plain terms, less force is required before their nervous system reports pain. Now here is the detail that separates real genetics from horoscope science, and it is the reason I trust this result. The effect is not general. Carriers were not simply found to be more sensitive to everything. They were more sensitive to being prodded with something sharp, and not to heat, and not to pressure. One specific channel, one specific kind of pain. The proposed mechanism fits that precision. The Neanderthal version appears to lower the threshold at which the nerve fires. The gate opens sooner. And these variants are not rare. Across Latin American countries, their frequency runs from about 2% to about 42%, rising with the proportion of Native American ancestry, highest in Peruvian populations. At the top of that range, in a room of 50 people, 21 of them are carrying it. That geographic pattern is worth understanding because it is not random and it is not about Peru. Ancestry from the first peoples of the Americas traces back through populations that crossed out of Northeast Asia, and those populations happened to carry these particular variants at high frequency when they made the journey. Every group descended from them inherited that starting hand. The variant did not become common because of anything that happened in the Americas. It became common because of who was standing at the door tens of thousands of years earlier. So a man in Lima and a man in Madrid can have the same complaint about the same injection and be running genuinely different hardware for reasons that were settled before either country existed. If you have ever been told you were dramatic about a needle or noticed that a paper cut takes more out of you than it seems to take out of everyone else, this is a real, measured, physical possibility rather than a character flaw. And that variant did not arrive on its own. It came north with people who were walking into country their bodies had never been built for, which is the thread running through everything else in this video. Because the cold was not the only problem waiting up there, so was the light. Ask a room of people what time they naturally wake up, and you will get an argument. Because most of us believe it is a matter of discipline. In December 2023, a study in genome biology and evolution looked at Neanderthal-derived variants sitting near the genes that run the circadian clock, the internal timing system that decides when you get sleepy and when you surface. They found something with an unusual shape. The variants did not scatter randomly in both directions, the way you would expect from noise. They pushed predominantly one way, toward being a morning person. The explanation for why is the part worth sitting with. Neanderthals had been living at high latitude for hundreds of thousands of years. Modern humans had not. And the further north you go, the more violently day length swings across the year. Long summer light, short winter light, a timing problem that never stops changing. A body clock tuned for the steady daylight near the equator handles that badly. So the population that had been solving that problem for 300,000 years already had the adaptation, a faster, more flexible internal clock. When the two groups interbred, the incoming population picked it up ready-made, which means that if you wake at 5 without an alarm, in a house full of people who cannot manage 7, you may be running a piece of timing equipment that was built for a European winter by a species that never saw Africa. But daylight and cold were survivable problems. The thing that killed people in that country was smaller than either. When modern humans arrived in Europe and Asia, they arrived as immigrants in a disease landscape they had never met. Local viruses, local parasites, local bacteria, none of it in their evolutionary memory. The Neanderthals had been there for hundreds of thousands of years. Their immune systems had been fighting those specific pathogens the whole time, and they had the receipts. When geneticists began sorting which Neanderthal genes survived in us and which faded, one category came back overrepresented, well beyond what chance would predict. Immune genes. In particular, the genes that detect and respond to RNA viruses, the family that includes coronaviruses. Think about what that implies. These segments were not merely tolerated in the modern human genome. They were kept, preferentially, because the people carrying them were more likely to survive and have children. A newly arrived population picked up a working local defense system from the population that had already been fighting those diseases and passed it forward. It is one of the clearest examples anywhere in the human genome of an inheritance being retained for a reason. The defense worked. But a defense that was built for one world is now running in a very different one. And that is where the inheritance starts to cost you something. An immune system is not a wall. It is a judgment, a constant decision about what counts as a threat and how hard to respond. Turn that judgment up, and you survive things that would otherwise kill you. Turn it up in a world with almost nothing left to fight, and it starts finding targets that were never dangerous. The archaic immune receptor variants that came from Neanderthals are strongly linked to allergy. That is the same setting, read in a different environment, in a world thick with parasites. An aggressive immune response is an asset. In a modern household, sealed, clean, largely parasite-free, the same aggression turns on pollen, on dust, on food. The literature ties these variants to allergy, to inflammation, and to autoimmune conditions. The same body of work also reports associations with depression risk, with blood clotting, and with tobacco use traits. Those need stating precisely, because this is exactly where the subject usually goes wrong. They are population-level associations with small effect sizes. They mean that among millions of people, carriers show slightly different odds. They do not mean that anyone's depression is Neanderthal, and they cannot tell you anything about yourself as an individual. A gene that shifts a risk is not a gene that decides an outcome. Small effects, honestly labeled. But the borrowed immune system had one more result in it, and that one was not small. It was measured, at scale, in living memory. In 2020, as the world tried to work out why COVID-19 killed some people and barely touched others, geneticists ran the obvious search. They looked for genetic factors in severe cases. The strongest single genetic risk factor they found, the largest one in the human genome, sits on chromosome 3, and when they traced where that stretch of DNA came from, the answer was Neanderthals. Sit with that for a second. A meeting between two populations 50,000 years ago produced a piece of DNA that measurably raised the chance of dying in a pandemic in 2020. That result went around the world, and for a while, it was the whole story, an ancient inheritance, still killing people. Then the same field found the other half. There is a second Neanderthal-derived region, this one on chromosome 12. It is associated with roughly a 22% reduction in the relative risk of becoming severely ill with the same virus. Not a rounding error. A meaningful protective effect, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Two inheritances. The same source population, one raising the risk of dying, one lowering it. In the same pandemic, in the same species, in bodies sitting in the same hospitals. This is why the question people usually ask about Neanderthal DNA, is it good or is it bad, has no answer. It was never one thing. It is a collection of separate settings that were useful in one world and are being tested every day in another one. Some of them are still helping, some of them are not. The sorting is still going on. And Neanderthals were not the only population we did this with. There is a second archaic group, the Denisovans, known mostly from a handful of fragments out of a single Siberian cave. Modern humans met them too, and the same thing happened. Their DNA turns up in living people across Asia, the Pacific, and Australia, at levels that reach several percent in some populations, far higher than the Neanderthal figure anywhere. And one of the inheritances they left is the clearest example of this entire phenomenon working. Tibetan populations carry a Denisovan-derived variant that helps the body cope with the thin air at extreme altitude. People are living on that plateau today, at heights that make most visitors ill, partly on the strength of a gene borrowed from a population that vanished before recorded history. That is what makes the pattern real, rather than a curiosity about one species. When our ancestors moved into hard country, they repeatedly picked up the local solution from whoever had already solved it. The Neanderthal inheritance in you is one instance of something humans did more than once. And the sorting left a gap. There is one hole in this inheritance so strange that it is still an open argument among the people who study it. And it is the part of this story I find hardest to put down. Roughly 2% of the genome of every non-African person alive is Neanderthal. That material is spread right across the chromosomes, but two pieces are missing, and they are the two that would matter most to a genealogist. The Neanderthal Y chromosome, the piece passed from father to son, unbroken down the direct male line, is not present in modern humans. Neither is Neanderthal mitochondrial DNA, the piece passed from mother to child down the direct female line. Those are precisely the two lines that a DNA test uses to trace deep ancestry, the direct paternal line and the direct maternal line. Both of them, from that population, are gone. Everything else came through. The pain channel came through, the body clock came through, the immune receptors came through, so successfully that they were actively preferred, but the two unbroken threads did not. Researchers have proposed explanations: genetic drift in small populations, incompatibilities that made some hybrid children less likely to survive or reproduce. And the honest position is that the argument is not settled. What is certain is the shape of it. The direct male line and the direct female line both ended, while the rest of the inheritance kept going, in you. So go back to that line on your results page. It is an inventory, the record of a working set of parts, kept because they were useful, running in you without ever asking permission. When you look at a Neanderthal percentage, you are looking at how much of an extinct species is still being used, which creates a problem, and it is the reason this story is not finished. Everything you have just heard was found by comparing large populations, statistically. Thousands of people grouped together, and a signal pulled out of the average. That method works, and it is how all of this was discovered. It cannot tell you which of these variants you personally carry. Your results page gives you a single percentage. It does not tell you whether you have the 3 SCN9A variants, or the circadian ones, or the chromosome 12 protection. The companies do not report it, and for most people the raw data sits in a file they have never opened. The science has moved a long way past what the product tells you. So the number on your page is real, and it is doing all of this, and it is also the least informative way that information could possibly have been handed to you. If a single percentage can hide that much about your own body, it is worth asking what else on that results page is being simplified into something you can screenshot. The percentages that change without warning, the matches you were never told about, the one line that can never change at all, each of those has the same kind of machinery underneath it. And if you know your own Neanderthal number, put it in the comments with where your family is from. There is a real pattern in how that number moves around the world, and it starts showing up as soon as enough people say theirs out loud.